pressure on time, I will have to impose an immediate time limit of 8 minutes once Nick Herbert has moved the motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion standing in my name and that of my honourable friend, the member for Ealing Southall. And I'm grateful to the Backbench Committee for allowing us to have this debate on ending tuberculosis. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe this is the first time that this issue has been debated on the floor of this House for 65 years. And in 1953, responding to an adjournment debate, the Joint Under-Secretary of State for Scotland, Commander T.D. Galbraith, said, and I quote, "Tuberculosis is still the major health problem in Scotland. We must press forward with every weapon that is available to us until the disease, which is said to be preventable, has been eradicated." And at that time, they were optimistic because antibiotics had been discovered and placed into mass production, housing was improving, and there was no reason to believe any longer that tuberculosis would not be beaten. This was the great killer of history, a disease that dates back at least 7,000 years. It's killed 2 billion people in the last 2 centuries alone. John Bunyan said that TB was the captain of all these men of death. TB, or consumption, or the White Death, is caused by a tiny bacteria. And when it was first identified in 1882, it was still killing 1 in 7 people. Indeed, in the late 19th century, TB killed more people in the United States than any other disease. It's a disease that's killed kings, poets, and paupers throughout history. Tutankhamun, Edward VI, Cardinal Richelieu, Eleanor Roosevelt, Keats, Chekhov, Emily Bronte, D.H. Lawrence, Orwell, Chopin, all died from TB. And of course, the heroines of La Bohème and La Traviata, when we go and see these operas on stage, notoriously die from tuberculosis, and that was expected in that age not so long ago. Millions of others down the ages have suffered from TB, notably Nelson Mandela, who suffered greatly from it. But with better housing, as I mentioned, better nutrition, the discovery of penicillin by Fleming in 1928, its mass production of antibiotics in the 1940s, it was thought that tuberculosis would be beaten. And a Nobel laureate virologist in 1962 said, "To write about infectious disease is almost to write about something that has passed into history." But TB resurged. It was not eradicated or eliminated at all. It resurged on the back of the AIDS epidemic. TB is a bug carried by a third of the world's population, can exist in our bodies latently, but strikes when immune systems are compromised. I give way to my honourable friend.
And congratulate him on securing this debate. You will know, as chair of the All-Party Group on HIV and AIDS, that we very much share his concerns about TB, and we're pleased to work with his All-Party Group as well. We met the Chief Executive of the Global Fund today. Would you agree with me? They're doing absolutely excellent work, not least because of that comorbidity between people living with HIV and AIDS and TB. People living with HIV are 30 times more likely to develop active TB, and TB is the leading killer of people with AIDS.
I strongly agree with the honourable gentleman, and the diseases must be treated together. However, there has been great progress made on tackling AIDS, partly because of the tremendous new tools that are available, and by comparison, less progress has been made on tuberculosis. Last year, 1.7 million people died of tuberculosis. That is more than AIDS and malaria combined. And that is the single fact that most people do not realise, that this is now the world's deadliest infectious disease, and it deserves more attention than it gets. 10 million people a year globally are falling ill as a result of this disease. TB was declared a global health emergency by the World Health Organization 24 years ago. Since then, 50 million people have died. It is not a great advert for the declaration of a global health emergency. 3 years ago, the world's leaders in New York set the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 3.3 says that these major epidemics will be eliminated in 15 years' time. At the current trajectory, TB will not be eliminated for 160 years' time. And that means that another 28 million people will die just in the Sustainable Development Goal period itself. And that will cost the world economy $1 trillion cumulatively by the end of that period. And the middle and lower income countries will be most severely hit. Lower income countries seeing something like 2% of their GDP reduced. On top of this, there are new threats. I mentioned that TB strikes when immune systems are compromised. They can be compromised in new ways by the acquisition of diabetes. In Indonesia, TB is striking people with diabetes, which is a growing problem. And then above all, and the thing that should concern this House greatly, is the growing risk of drug resistance. TB is the only major drug-resistant infection which is transmitted through the air, and it's responsible already for 1 in 3 deaths worldwide from all forms of drug resistance. Drug resistance generally is now killing 700,000 people a year, but Lord O'Neill's commission, set up by David Cameron, predicted that by 2050, drug resistance would kill 10 million people a year. Those deaths would fall in the West and advanced economies, not just in poorer and middle-income ones. That compares with, for instance, 8 million deaths a year currently from cancer. So we're talking about catastrophic loss, catastrophic economic cost, a cumulative GDP loss of $100 trillion, knocking 2 to 3.5% off global GDP. And the significant point is this: a quarter of those deaths from antimicrobial resistance would be from tuberculosis, which is already responsible for a third of antimicrobial resistant deaths. That's 200,000 deaths a year. Give way to the honourable gentleman.
Excellent speech. Would you also accept one other factor, and that is the connection between TB and conflict? The parts of the world where TB is rife are South Sudan, which I know very well, where conflict is adding to the complexity of people suffering from disease. Would you agree?
It's a very interesting point by the honourable gentleman. TB is a disease of poverty. If there are not basic health systems, if nutrition is poor, if housing is poor, all of those conditions would probably exist in these conflict areas, then it is an opportunistic infection that will strike. Drug-resistant TB is a terrible affliction. It can be dealt with, but even in an advanced healthcare system, it requires a course of treatment. Some 14,000 pills have to be taken, an appalling treatment that can make patients go deaf and creates a lot of suffering. And indeed, only half of drug-resistant TB patients are successfully treated. There's a lower survival rate for drug-resistant TB than for lung cancer. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you for giving way. The honourable gentleman, just to step back, he mentioned about diabetes. The issues for us in diabetes in this country is we can change our lifestyles because we've got access to lots of food and other things we can do to reduce our diabetes. But in countries, third world countries where TB is rampant, where diabetes is rampant, they don't have the same choice. That complicates the issue. Does the honourable member agree with that?
I agree with the honourable gentleman, and it's that there are a growing list of reasons why we should act, and that is one of them. I mentioned that most people don't. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Well, he's making a very powerful speech. He's right, I think, to draw attention to the scale of the problem in the developed world as well as the developing world. In my constituency, the incidence is now about the same as it is in Sudan, at just over 80 per 100,000. Does he agree it's important that people realise this is a treatable, notwithstanding the drug resistance, a treatable and curable condition, and people need to get help when they are suffering from it?
Yes, again, I agree with the honourable gentleman. Actually, TB in London makes it one of the TB capitals of Europe. We have something like 5,000 cases of TB in the UK. That is coming down with a new public health strategy, but it is still too high. And he is right. This is a disease that is easily and cheaply curable and has been since the discovery of antibiotics. So the question is, why aren't we doing it? I'll give way to my honourable friend. Yeah.
It was a very powerful speech, but would he also, further his point about the importance of public health, would he urge the government in its future strategy to make sure that we look at the NHS public health and social care as part of a single system?
Yes, my honourable friend is probably aware that there is a collaborative TB strategy that was introduced by the government, urged by the committee that my honourable friend, the member for Ealing Southall, and I co-chair, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Global TB. That has shows very promising signs, and it represents exactly the kind of partnership that we need between Public Health England and NHS England, and I commend the government for having introduced that partnership. Most people also do not realise there is no vaccine for tuberculosis. There is a child vaccine, BCG, that some of us had when we were young, but there is no adult vaccine that works for tuberculosis, and there is no epidemic in human history that has been beaten without a vaccine. The reason there isn't a vaccine is because there is market failure. Unlike for HIV and AIDS, this is primarily a disease of the poor. For HIV/AIDS, there were people dying in Western countries as well. The pharmaceutical companies do not have a commercial incentive to invest in the new tools that we need: better drugs, better diagnostics, a vaccine. And without partnership funding that comes from the government and governments around the world that can afford it, we will not develop these new tools, and we will not beat TB in the requisite time frame. So I would argue, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to him and thank him for all the work he does on TB. As chair of the All-Party Group on Malaria and Neglected Tropical Diseases, I'd like to point out that actually, in the case of malaria, there is a vaccine which is just being deployed at the moment for the first time. Now, we're not sure how effective it is. It's clearly quite effective, but there needs a lot more work to be done on it. But there are people such as GSK who are behind this vaccine, who are prepared to invest in them, even though there is no commercial return to them. So let's hope that a similar approach will be taken by commercial companies and governments in respect of TB.
Well, I agree that there are some companies that are willing to take a non-commercial view of this, Johnson & Johnson and Osaka, but actually there are many other major pharmaceutical companies that are not developing new TB tools because there is no commercial incentive. So we do need that partnership funding to make this happen. So I would argue, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are three powerful reasons for us to act. A humanitarian reason because of the level of deaths, the economic reason because of the cost to the global economy of not doing so, and a global health security reason because of the risk of drug resistance. I give way to my honourable friend.
Just make a practical suggestion. We sometimes hear that the overseas aid budget struggles to find the best possible causes in which to invest our 0.7% of GDP. Could the rules possibly allow an investment in the sort of research that's necessary to find a cure for TB from that fund?
My understanding is they already do, and that's a very good example of how we already do, but need to do more, deploy the resources that are available to us, and indeed the commitment that we make through the Global Fund, the second biggest donor in the Global Fund to end malaria, HIV, AIDS and TB, 1.2 billion in the last replenishment, has been made possible because of the increase in aid spending and the target that has been met. At last, this disease is commanding greater political attention. It has got onto the G7 and G20 agenda, partly because of the lobbying that has been done by the Global TB Caucus, which I co-chair with South Africa's Health Minister, and now numbers 2,500 parliamentarians in 130 countries. There was a WHO Ministerial Summit in Moscow in November. In February, Prime Minister Modi of India announced a TB strategy. And above all, there is a reason to be optimistic because at the United Nations on the 26th of September, there will, for the first time ever, be a high-level meeting on tuberculosis that is intended for heads of government and heads of state to attend, at which a new declaration will be launched with a commitment by the world's leaders to act. And that has to address the funding gap that there currently is. We are $6 billion a year short of funding properly to eliminate TB by the SDG deadline in 15 years' time. It has to introduce greater accountability so that governments are locked in to proper targets which ensure that actually they do reduce TB, and there needs to be a dramatic increase in research and development to develop the new tools that I mentioned. And all of this requires leadership. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I'm hoping to speak later in the debate, but he is making a powerful case. Could I just ask him, has he had any indication from the Prime Minister whether or not she intends to attend this high-level meeting? Because it would seem to be of great significance that she does.
My right honourable friend asks a very pertinent question. 100 members of this House and the other place wrote to the Prime Minister last month to ask if she would attend this meeting. And the motion that is before the House today specifically requests that the Prime Minister attends, which is what the UN General Assembly has asked. So far, I believe, understandably, the Prime Minister is not committing that she will attend. But I would like, in the remaining minute that is available to me to speak, to make the case for the Prime Minister attending this meeting. This would be completely consistent with UK government policy. We have made this major investment in the Global Fund. We are world leaders in international development. We set the agenda on antimicrobial resistance. We have a leadership position, and we should take it on this issue, because TB is now the world's deadliest infectious disease. It needs the support and attention of the world's leaders, and the UK is in a very powerful position to show the leadership and to give that support. And indeed, it is very difficult to see what the downside would be from the Prime Minister attending. I believe it would be all upside, and it would send a very powerful message to other world leaders. It is completely consistent with the ambition for global Britain. Indeed, it's worth noting that TB is an issue in 19 Commonwealth countries, and 17 DFID priority countries are high burden. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The high-level meeting is the chance, at last, for this disease to get the attention that it needs. It is an easily and cheaply curable disease, and frankly, it is a global scandal that so many people are losing their lives completely unnecessarily when, since the 1940s, they need not have done so. We can act, we should act. The UK can play a major role in this respect. And speaking at the UN on Monday, I was asked the question, what is the single message that I would want to send to the world's leaders about whether or not they should attend? And I simply said this: if 1.7 million deaths a year is not enough to encourage the world's leaders to attend, what is? Yeah.